So good morning and happy Martin Luther King Day. I hope this is both a holiday and a holy day for all of us. I want to say at the beginning that I didn't discuss this with my colleagues, but I'm sure they'll agree that this is an appropriate thing to do. I've been looking at tweets from Bernice King, Martin Luther King's daughter, and she's been asking people to be sure to remember her mother, Coretta Scott King, today. So I want to dedicate this reading, this public reading of Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail to the memory and the legacy of Coretta Scott King. I tweeted back to her that we were going to do this just a few minutes ago, and I'm going to read two of her tweets. This is from yesterday. Thinking of my mother, she persisted even when several men from the movement advised her to stay home with her children. She founded the King Center 3 months after Daddy was assassinated and worked to realize the King holiday, and she was a global leader. And then this morning, she tweeted, "As you honor my father today, please honor my mother as well. She was the architect of the King legacy and founder of the King Center, which she founded less than 3 months after Daddy died. Without Coretta Scott King, there would be no MLK Day." So we just want to say thank you to the memory, the legacy, and the ongoing work of Coretta Scott King. So Alexis, who was my co-worker in this, my colleague, and also we are both members of the Island United Church in Foster City, is going to also welcome you to this education event.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for participating in this program. It is so important to Reverend Jim. He has worked so hard on it. It's such a labor of love for him. So it's so important for us to remember and honor Dr. King and Coretta Scott King. There are a lot of women that fought in the civil rights movement, and she is probably the queen of those ladies. I know when we were talking about doing something like this, I also thought about one of his quotes about police brutality, and it's still happening today. There is still Black men are shot in their backs or shot in their cars, or young Black women are shot and murdered in their bedrooms by police officers. So I think my commitment to the Dr. King legacy is to make sure that I speak up about social justice and equity and policing. I also want to thank several women on this group that have been very instrumental in helping us have this program. Dana Isaacson and Sue Brockstein, Sarah Fields, Diana Farner, I'm sorry. all of those ladies have worked hard to get this to you. And again, thank you to all of you for taking your time to read this, this letter. It's, to me, a very emotional letter. I tried to read parts of it again last night. I hadn't read it since I was in the 10th grade, and which was a long time ago. And it is it's emotional. It pulls at your heartstrings that people just want to shop, and there's things that prevent them from doing that, ugliness and signs, or just the ability of not being able to touch things when you go into shop. So we've come a long way. We have a long way to go. And I know with the support of the Peninsula Multifaith, we will address all of this. And one day, Dr. King's dream will be real. There will be racial equity, and along with that, economical and social equity for all Americans. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexis. So before we read the letter together, we're going to start a week earlier, before the letter was written, with an ad that several 8 prominent white Birmingham clergymen, Christian and Jewish, took out in the newspaper on Palm Sunday in 1963. And I've asked 4 of my colleagues to read that brief ad. It takes the form of a letter also. And this is the letter to which Dr. King was responding in the letter that he wrote while he was in prison. Dr. King came to Birmingham at the invitation of his organization. He also was a Baptist minister and was a pastor of a Baptist church at that time at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, where Ralph Warnock was just elected from there to go to Congress. But so he came at their invitation specifically because he was asked to help them organize a boycott of downtown stores in Birmingham that were all still segregated in 1963. And they organized it for that week in April because Easter was a big week. People bought new outfits. And so they wanted to ask the communities, Black and white, to boycott the segregated stores. And the merchants brought pressure and obtained a court injunction to prevent Dr. King from speaking in public or in any way organizing any protest activity, a peaceful, nonviolent protest, I might add. So this is their letter that they took out, and I've asked 4 of my colleagues to read it. So they're going to start with that. It's called A Call for Unity, a letter to Dr. Martin Luther King, dated April 12th, 1963.
We, the undersigned clergymen, are among those who in January issued an appeal for law and order and common sense in dealing with racial problems in Alabama. We expressed understanding that honest convictions in racial matters could properly be pursued in the courts, but urged that decisions of those courts should in the meantime be peacefully obeyed. Since that time, there have been some evidence of increased forbearance and a willingness to face facts. Responsible citizens have undertaken the work on various problems which cause racial friction and unrest. In Birmingham, recent public events have given indication that we will have opportunity for a new constructive and realistic approach to racial problems.
However, we are not confronted by a series of demonstrations by some of our Negro citizens, directed and led in part by outsiders. We recognize the natural impatience of people who feel that their hopes are slow in being realized, but we are convinced that these demonstrations are unwise and untimely. We agree rather with certain local Negro leadership, which has called for honest and open negotiation of racial issues in our area. And we believe that this kind of facing of issues can best be accomplished by citizens of our own metro, white and Negro, meeting with their knowledge and experience of the local situation. All of us need to face that responsibility and find proper channels for its accomplishment.
Just as we formerly pointed out that hatred and violence have no sanction in our religious and political traditions, we also point out that such actions as incite hatred and violence, however technically peaceful those actions may be, have not contributed to the resolution of our local problems. We do not believe that these days of new hope are days when extreme measures are justified in Birmingham. We commend the community as a whole and the local news media and law enforcement officials in particular on the calm manner in which these demonstrations have been handled. We urge the public to continue to show restraint should the demonstrations continue, and the law enforcement officials to remain calm and continue to protect our city from violence.
We further strongly urge our own Negro community to withdraw support from these demonstrations and to unite locally in working peacefully for a better Birmingham. When rights are consistently denied, a cause should be pressed in the courts and in negotiations among local leaders and not in the streets. We appeal to both our white and Negro citizenry to observe the principles of law and order and common sense. Signed by C.C.J. Carpenter, Bishop of Alabama, Joseph Durek, Auxiliary Bishop, Diocese of Mobile, Birmingham. Rabbi Milton Grafman, Temple Emmanuel, Birmingham. Bishop Paul Hardin, Bishop of the Alabama West Florida Conference of the Methodist Church. Bishop Nolan Harmon, Bishop of the North Alabama Conference of the Methodist Church. George Murray, Bishop Coadjutor, Episcopal Diocese of Alabama. Edward Ramage, Moderator, Synod of the Alabama Presbyterian Church in the United States. And Earl Stallings, Pastor, First Baptist Church, Birmingham, Alabama.
So both the law, the courts, and the Merchants Association and the progressive clergy in town have expressed themselves to Dr. King. Do not come to Birmingham. Do not organize any protests. Do not appear in public. Here's a short video of what happened on Good Friday when King made his first appearance outside of a church, and he was immediately arrested.
Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
African Americans in Alabama have had enough. In spring 1963, in the state's largest city, Birmingham, they staged nonviolent demonstrations. Wallace responds. Protests are banned. Those arrested forced to pay high bail. Then, America's most prominent civil rights leader comes to Birmingham. April 12th, Good Friday. Martin Luther King Jr. and Ralph Abernathy lead a march from the 16th Street Baptist Church. They are arrested. It is here that King pens his now celebrated letter from Birmingham jail, defending the resistance of African Americans. In solitary confinement, he writes, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." The letter becomes a touchstone for the civil rights movement.
So as you can see, King was arrested literally within minutes of leaving the church, and he was immediately put into solitary confinement in the Birmingham City Jail, where he was for over a week. At first, he was denied even access to counsel. It was there that a guard gave him a copy of the full-page ad that was read for us earlier, written by the 8 white prominent Birmingham clergymen. And King became consumed with responding to this letter. Now, just a few things about the letter itself. He wrote entirely from memory. He had no access to books. Initially, he wrote it using pencil stubs that were smuggled into him and on scraps of newspaper. Eventually, he was given actual paper to write on. His lawyer smuggled these scraps of paper out through under his shirt like this. He showed, there are pictures of it. He stuck them in here and then smuggled them out. At night, his secretary typed them, and she said later he may have been a great speaker, but he had terrible handwriting, and she called it chicken scratch. Nevertheless, she transformed it into a legible document that was first published shortly thereafter by the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers, and then more widely distributed. And it became a classic in spirituality literature and also in the literature of protest, way beyond even just what was happening in Birmingham. What's remarkable about it is, as I'm sure we all have noticed or will notice shortly, is that he quoted widely from the Bible, from literature, from history, and makes complex, cogent arguments. Again, all of this from memory. It's something that might have been lost, but instead found its way to prominence. A number of theologians have suggested that it should be added to the Bible. I keep a copy of it in my Bible. And I think it has that kind of timeless quality. And I hope that you'll love it in the same way as we read it together. Now, remember, readers, you'll have the capacity to unmute yourself. I ask your patience with us, all of us who are reading along or listening along. We've never done something quite like this on Zoom and with this many readers. Thank you, all of our readers. So we'll begin right now with the letter. After we've read the letter, which takes about 45 or 50 minutes, then you'll have a chance, if you wish, to stay afterwards, to be in small groups for 15 minutes to describe for each other how we feel about it and the impact of it on us today. So let's begin now our reading of the letter from the Birmingham jail.
My dear fellow clergymen, while confined here in the Birmingham City Jail, I came across your recent statement calling our president activities unwise and untimely. Seldom, if ever, do I pause to answer criticism of my work and ideas. If I sought to answer all of the criticisms that crossed my desk, my secretaries would be engaged in little else in the course of the day, and I would have no time for constructive work. But since I feel that you are men of genuine goodwill and your criticisms are sincerely set forth, I would like to answer your statement in what I hope will be patient and reasonable terms.
I think I should give the reason for my being in Birmingham, since you have been influenced by the argument of outsiders coming in. I have the honor of serving as president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, an organization operating in every Southern state with headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia. We have some 85 affiliate organizations all across the South, one being the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights. Whenever necessary and possible, we share staff, education, and financial resources with our affiliates. Several months ago, our local affiliate here in Birmingham invited us to be on call to engage in nonviolent direct action program, if such were deemed necessary. We readily consented, and when the hour came, we lived up to our promises. So I am here, along with several members of my staff, because we were invited here. I am here because I have basic organizational ties here.
Beyond this, I am in Birmingham because injustice is here. Just as the 8th century prophets left their little villages and carried their "Thus saith the Lord" far beyond the boundaries of their hometowns. And just as the Apostle Paul left his little village of Tarsus and carried the gospel of Jesus Christ to practically every hamlet and city of the Greco-Roman world, I too am compelled to carry the gospel of freedom beyond my particular hometown. Like Paul, I must constantly respond to the Macedonian call for aid.
Moreover, I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Never again can we afford to live with the narrow, provincial, outside agitator idea. anyone who lives in the United States can never be considered an outsider anywhere in this country.
Deplore the demonstrations that are presently taking place in Birmingham, but I am sorry that your statement did not express a similar concern for the conditions that are brought the demonstrations into being. I am sure that each of you would want to go beyond the superficial social analyst who looks merely at effects and does not grapple with underlying causes. I would not hesitate to say that it is unfortunate that so-called demonstrations are taking place in Birmingham at this time. But I would say in more emphatic terms that it is more unfortunate that the white power structure of this city has left the Negro community with no other alternative.
In any nonviolent campaign, there are 4 basic steps. 1, collection of the facts to determine whether injustices are alive. 2, negotiation. 3, self-purification. And 4, direct action. We have gone through all of these steps in Birmingham. There can be no gainsaying of the fact that racial injustice engulfs this community.
Birmingham is probably the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States. Its ugly record of police brutality is known in every section of this country. Its unjust treatment of Negroes in the courts is a notorious reality. There have been more unsolved bombings of Negro homes and churches in Birmingham than any city in this nation. These are the hard, brutal, and unbelievable facts. On the basis of these conditions, Negro leaders sought to negotiate with the city fathers, but the political leaders consistently refused to engage in good faith negotiation.
Then last September came the opportunity to talk with leaders of Birmingham's economic community. In the course of the negotiations, certain promises were made by the merchants. For example, to remove the store's humiliating racial signs. On the basis of these promises, the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth and the leaders of the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights agreed to a moratorium on all demonstrations. As the weeks and months went by, we realized that we were the victims of a broken promise. A few signs, briefly removed, returned. The others remained. As in so many past experiences, our hopes had been blasted, and the shadow of deep disappointment settled upon us. We had no alternative except to prepare for direct action, whereby we would present our very bodies as a means of laying our case before the conscience of the local and the national community. Mindful of the difficulties involved, we decided to undertake a process of self-purification. We began a series of workshops on nonviolence and repeatedly asked ourselves, are you able to accept blows without retaliating? Are you able to endure the ordeal of jail? We decided to schedule our direct action program for the Easter season, realizing that except for Christmas, this is the main shopping period of the year. Knowing that a strong economic withdrawal program would be the byproduct of direct action, we felt this would be the best time to bring pressure on the merchants for the needed change. Then it occurred to us that Birmingham's mayoral election was coming up in March, and we speedily decided to postpone action until after the election day. When we discovered that the Commissioner of Public Safety, Eugene Bull Connor, had piled up enough votes to be in the runoff, we decided again to postpone our action until the day after the runoff, so the demonstrations could not be used to cloud the issues. Like many others, we waited to see Mr. Connor defeated, and to this end, we endured postponement after postponement. Having aided in this community need, we felt that our direct action program could be delayed no longer.
This reveals that we did not move irresponsibly into direct action. We too wanted to see Mr. Connor defeated, so we went through postponement after postponement to aid in this community need. After this, we felt that that direct action could be delayed no longer. You may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, etc.? Negotiation. Indeed, this is the purpose of direct action. Non-violent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and establish such creative tension that a community that has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks so to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. I just referred to the creation of tension as a part of the work of the nonviolent resistor. This may sound rather shocking, but I must confess that I'm not afraid of the word tension. I have earnestly worked and preached against violent tension, but there is a type of constructive nonviolent tension that is necessary for growth. Just as Socrates felt that it was necessary to create a tension in the mind so that individuals could rise from the bondage of myths and half-truths to the unfettered realm of creative analysis and objective appraisal, we must see the need of having nonviolent gadflies to create the kind of tension in society that will help men to rise from the dark depths of prejudice and racism to the majestic heights of understanding and brotherhood. So the purpose of direct action is to create a situation so crisis packed that it will inevitably open the door to negotiation. We therefore concur with you that in your call for negotiation, too long has our beloved Southland been bogged down in the tragic attempt to live in monologue rather than dialogue.
One of the basic points in your statement is that our acts are untimely. Some have asked, why don't you give the new administration time to act? The only answer I can give to that inquiry is the new administration must be probed about as much as the outgoing one before it acts. We will be sadly mistaken if we feel that the election of Mr. Boutwell will bring the millennium to Birmingham. While Mr. Boutwell is much more articulate and gentle than Mr. Connor, they are both a segregationist, dedicated to the task of maintaining the status quo. The hope I see in Mr. Boutwell is that he will be reasonable enough to see the futility of massive resistance to desegregation, but he will not see this without pressure from the devotees of civil rights. My friends, I must say to you that we have not made a single gain in civil rights without determined legal and nonviolent pressure. History is the long and tragic story of the fact that privileged groups seldom give up their privileges voluntarily. Individuals may see the moral light and voluntarily give up their unjust posture. But as Reinhold Niebuhr has reminded us, groups are more immoral than individuals.
We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I have never yet engaged in a direct action movement that was well-timed, according to the timetable of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. For years now, I have heard the words, wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with a piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. It has been a tranquilizing thalidomide, relieving the emotional stress for a moment, only to give birth to an ill-formed infant of frustration. We must come to see with the distinguished jurist of yesterday that justice too long delayed is justice denied. We have waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights. The nations of Asia and Africa are moving with jet-like speed toward the goal of political independence. And we still creep at horse and buggy pace toward the gaining of a cup of coffee at a lunch counter. I guess it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, wait. But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, brutalize, and even kill your Black brothers and sisters with impunity, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to a public amusement park that has just been advertised on television, and you see tears welling up in her little eyes when she is told that Funtown is closed to colored children, and see the depressing clouds of inferiority begin to form in her little mental sky, and see her begin to distort her little personality by unconsciously developing a bitterness toward white people. When you have to concoct an answer for the 5-year-old son asking an agonizing pathos, Daddy, why do white people treat colored people so mean? When you take a cross-country drive and find it necessary to sleep night after night in the uncomfortable corners of your automobile because no motel will accept you. When you are humiliated day in and day out by nagging signs reading white and colored, when your first name becomes nigger and your middle name becomes boy, however old you are, and your last name becomes John, and when your wife and mother are never given the respected title Mrs., when you are harried by day and haunted by night by the fact that you are a Negro, living constantly at tiptoe stance, never quite knowing what to expect next, and plagued with inner fears and outer resentments, when you are forever fighting a denigrating sense of nobodiness, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over and men are no longer willing to be plunged into an abyss of injustice where they can experience the blackness of corroding despair. I hope, sirs, you can understand our legitimate and unavoidable impatience.
You express a great deal of anxiety over our willingness to break laws. This is a certain legitimate concern, since we so diligently urge people to obey the Supreme Court's decision of 1954 outlawing segregation in the public schools. It is rather strange and paradoxical to find us consciously breaking laws and obeying others. One may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer is found in the fact that there are two types of laws. There are just laws and unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. Now, what is the difference between the two? How does one determine when a law is just? A just law is a man-made law code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it into the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul, and damages the personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority. It gives to use the words of Martin Buber, the great Jewish philosopher, segregation substitutes the I-it relationship for the I-thou relationship and ends up regulating persons to the status of things. So segregation is not only politically, economically, and sociologically unsound, but it is morally wrong and sinful. Paul Tillich has said that sin is separation. Isn't segregation an existential expression of man's tragic separation, an expression of his awful estrangement, his terrible sinfulness? So I can urge men to disobey segregation ordinances because they are morally wrong.
Let us turn to a more concrete example of just and unjust laws. An unjust law is a code that a majority inflicts on a minority that is not binding on itself. This is difference made legal. On the other hand, a just law is a code that a majority compels a minority to follow that it is willing to follow itself. This is sameness made legal. Let me give another example. An unjust law is a code inflicted upon a minority which that minority had no part in enacting or creating, because they did not have the unhampered right to vote. Who can say that the legislature of Alabama, which set up the segregation laws, was democratically elected? Throughout the state of Alabama, all types of conniving methods are used to prevent Negroes from becoming registered voters, and there are some counties without a single Negro registered to vote, despite the fact that the Negro constitutes a majority of the population. Can any law set up in such a state be considered democratically structured?
These are just a few examples of unjust and just laws. There are some instances when a law is just on its face and unjust in its application. For instance, I was arrested Friday on a charge of parading without a permit. Now, there's nothing wrong with an ordinance which requires a permit for a parade. But when the ordinance is used to preserve segregation and to deny citizens the First Amendment privilege of peaceful assembly and peaceful protest, then it becomes unjust. I hope you can see the distinction I'm trying to point out. In no sense do I advocate evading or defying the law as the rabid segregationist would do. This would lead to anarchy. One who breaks an unjust law must do it openly, lovingly, not hatefully, as the white mothers did in New Orleans when they were seen on television screaming, "Nigger, nigger, nigger," and with a willingness to accept the penalty. I submit that an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and willingly accepts the penalty by staying in jail to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice is in reality expressing the very highest respect for law. Of course, there's nothing new about this kind of civil disobedience. It was seen sublimely in the refusal of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to obey the laws of Nebuchadnezzar because a higher moral law was involved. It was practiced superbly by the early Christians who were willing to face hungry lions and the excruciating pain of chopping blocks before submitting to certain unjust laws of the Roman Empire. To a degree, academic freedom is a reality today because Socrates practiced civil disobedience.
Can never forget, excuse me, we can never forget that everything Hitler did in Germany was legal. and everything the Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was illegal. It was illegal to aid and comfort a Jew in Hitler's Germany. But I am sure that if I had lived in Germany during that time, I would have aided and comforted my Jewish brothers, even though it was illegal. If I lived in a communist country today where certain principles dear to the Christian faith are suppressed, I believe I would openly advocate disobeying these anti-religious laws. I must make two honest confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the last few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride toward freedom is not the white citizens' counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I can't agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically feels that he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by the myth, of time, and who constantly advised the Negro to wait until a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection.
I had hoped that the white moderate would understand that law and order exists for the purpose of establishing justice, and that when they fail to do this, they become dangerously structured dams that block the flow of social progress. I had hoped that the white moderate would understand that the present tension of the South is merely a necessary phase of the transition from an obnoxious negative peace, where the Negro passively accepted his unjust plight, to a substance-filled positive peace, where all men will respect the dignity and worth of human personality. Actually, we who engage in non-violent direct action are not the creators of tension. We merely bring to the surface the hidden tension that is already alive. We bring it out in the open where it can be seen and dealt with, like a boil that can never be cured as long as it is covered up, but must be opened with all its pus-flowing ugliness to the natural medicines of air and light. Injustice must likewise be exposed with all of the tension its exposing creates, to the light of human conscience and the air of national opinion before it can be cured.
In your statement, you asserted that our actions, even though peaceful, must be condemned because they precipitate violence. But can this assertion be logically made? Isn't this like condemning the robbed man because his possession of money precipitate the evil act of robbery? Isn't this like condemning Socrates because his unswerving commitment to the truth and his philosophical delvings precipitated misguided popular mind to make him drink the hemlock? Isn't this like condemning Jesus because his unique God consciousness and never ceasing devotions to his will precipitated the evil act of crucifixion? We must come to see, as federal courts have consistently affirmed, that it is immoral to urge an individual to withdraw his efforts to gain his basic constitutional rights because the quest precipitates violence. Society must protect the robbed and punish the robber. I had hoped that the white moderate would reject the myth of. I received a letter this morning from a white brother in Texas, which said, All Christians know that the colored people will receive equal rights eventually. But it is possible that you are in too great of a religious hurry. It has taken Christianity almost 2,000 years to accomplish what it has. The teachings of Christ take time to come to earth. All that is said here grows out of a tragic misconception of time. It is the strangely irrational notion that there is some very flow of time that will inevitably cure all ills. Actually, it's neutral. It can be used either destructively or constructively. I am coming to feel that the people of ill will have used time much more effectively than the people of goodwill. We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the vitriolic words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. We must come to see that human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts and persistent work of men willing to be co-workers with God. And with his hard word, time itself becomes an ally of the forces of social stagnation. We must use time creatively and forever realize the time is always ripe to do right. Now is the time to make real the promise of democracy and transform our pending national elegy into a creative psalm of brotherhood. Now is the time to lift our national policy from the quicksand of racial injustice to the solid rock of human dignity.
You speak of our activity in Birmingham as extreme. At first, I was rather disappointed that fellow clergymen would see my nonviolent efforts as those of an extremist. I began thinking about the fact that I stand in the middle of two opposing forces in the Negro community. One is a force of complacency, made up in part of Negroes who, as a result of long years of oppression, are so drained of self-respect and a sense of somebodyness that they have adjusted to segregation. And in part of a few middle-class Negroes who, because of a degree of academic and economic security, and because in some ways they profit by segregation, have become insensitive to the problems of the masses. The other force is one of bitterness and hatred, and it comes perilously close to advocating violence. It is expressed in the various Black nationalist groups that are springing up across the nation, the largest and best known being Elijah Muhammad's Muslim movement. Nourished by the Negro's frustration over the continued existence of racial discrimination, this movement is made up of people who have lost faith in America, who have absolutely repudiated Christianity, and who have concluded that the white man is an incorrigible devil. I have tried to stand between these two forces, saying that we need emulate neither the do-nothingism of the complacent nor the hatred and despair of the Black nationalist. For there is the more excellent way of love and nonviolent protest. I am grateful to God that through the influence of the Negro Church, the way of nonviolence became an integral part of our struggle. If this philosophy had not emerged, by now many streets of the South would, I am convinced, be flowing with blood. And I am further convinced that if our white brothers dismiss as rabble-rousers and outside agitators those of us who employ nonviolent direct action, and if they refuse to support our nonviolent efforts, millions of Negroes will, out of frustration and despair, seek solace and security in Black nationalist ideologies, a development that would inevitably lead to a frightening racial nightmare.
Oppressed people cannot remain oppressed forever. The urge for freedom will eventually come. This is what happened to the American Negro. Something within has reminded him of his birthright and freedom, and something without has reminded him that he can gain it. Consciously and unconsciously, he has been swept in what the Germans call zeitgeist, and with his Black brothers of Africa and his brown and yellow brothers of Asia, South America and Caribbean, he is moving with a sense of cosmic urgency towards the promised land of racial justice. Recognizing this vital urge that has engulfed the Negro community, one should readily understand public demonstrations. The Negro has many pent-up resentments and latent frustrations, and he has to get them out. So let him march sometime. Let him have his prayer pilgrimages to City Hall. Understand why he must have sit-ins and freedom rides. If his repressed emotions do not come out in nonviolent ways, they will come out in ominous expressions of violence. This is not a threat. It's a fact of history. So I've not said to my people, get rid of your discontent, but I've tried to say that this is normal and healthy. Discontent can be channelized through the creative outlet of nonviolent direct action. Now, this approach has been dismissed as extremist. I must admit that I was initially disappointed in being so categorized.
But as I thought about the matter, I gradually gained a bit of satisfaction from being considered an extremist. Was not Jesus an extremist in love? Love your enemies. Bless them when they curse you. Pray for them when they are despitefully use you. Was not Amos an extremist for justice? Let justice roll down like the waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Was not Paul an extremist for the gospel of Jesus Christ? I bear in my body the marks of the Lord Jesus. Was not Martin Luther an extremist? Here I stand. I can do none other, so help me God. Was not John Bunyan an extremist? I will stay in jail to the end of my days before I make butchery of my conscience. Was not Abraham Lincoln an extremist? This nation cannot survive half slave and half free. Was not Thomas Jefferson an extremist? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. So the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremist will we be? Will we be extremists for hate, or will we be extremists for love? Will we be extremists for preservation of injustice, or will we be extremists for the cause of justice? In the dramatic scene on Calvary's Hill, 3 men were crucified. We will not forget that all 3 were crucified for the same crime, the crime of extremism. 2 were extremists for immorality, and thusly fell below their environment. The other, Jesus Christ, was an extremist for love, truth, and goodness, and thereby rose above his environment. So, after all, maybe the South, the nation, and the world are in dire need of creative extremists.
I had hoped that the white moderate would see this. Maybe I was too optimistic. Maybe I expected too much. I guess I should have realized that few members of a race that has oppressed another race can understand or appreciate the deep groans and passionate yearnings of those that have been oppressed, and still fewer have the vision to see that injustice must be rooted out by strong, persistent, and determined action. I am thankful, however, that some of our white brothers have grasped the meaning of this social revolution and committed themselves to it. They are still all too small in quantity, but they are big in quality. Some like Ralph McGill, Lillian Smith, Harry Golden, and James Dabbs have written about our struggle in eloquent, prophetic, and understanding terms. Others have marched with us down nameless streets of the South. They have languished in filthy, roach-infested jails, suffering the abuse and brutality of angry policemen who see them as dirty N-word lovers. They, unlike so many of their moderate brothers and sisters, have recognized the urgency of the moment and sensed the need for powerful action antidotes to combat the disease of segregation. Let me rush on to mention my other disappointment. I have been so greatly disappointed with the white church and its leadership. Of course, there are some notable exceptions. I am not unmindful of the fact that each of you has taken some significant stance on this issue. I commend you, Reverend Stallings, for your Christian stance on this past Sunday in welcoming Negroes to your worship service on a non-segregated basis. I commend the Catholic leaders of the state for integrating Spring Hill College several years ago.
But despite these notable exceptions, I must honestly reiterate that I have been disappointed with the church. I do not say that as one of the negative critics who can always find something wrong with the church. I say it as a minister of the gospel who loves the church, who was nurtured in its bosom, who has been sustained by its spiritual blessings, and who will remain true so to its end, the core of my life, as long as it exists and its length. I had the strange feeling that I was suddenly catapulted in the leadership of the bus protest in Montgomery several years ago, that we would have the support of the white church. I felt that the white ministers, priests, and rabbis of the South would become some of our strongest allies. Instead, some have been outright opponents, refusing to understand the freedom movement and misrepresenting its leaders. All too many others have been more cautious than courageous and have remained silent behind the anti-styling security of the stained glass windows. In spite of my shattered dreams of the past, I come to Birmingham with the hope that the white religious leadership of this community would see the justice of our cause and with deep moral concern serve as a channel through which our just grievances would get to the power structure. I hope that each of you would understand. But again, I've been disappointed. I have heard numerous religious leaders of the South call upon their worshipers to comply with the desegregation decision because it is the law. But I've longed to hear white ministers say, follow this decree because integration is morally right and the Negro is your brother. In the midst of the blatant injustices inflicted upon the Negro, I have watched white churches stand on the sideline and merely mouth pious irrelevancies and sanctimonious trivialities. In the midst of a mighty struggle to rid our nation of racial and economic injustice, I've heard so many ministers say, oh, those are social issues with which the gospel has no real concern. And I've watched so many churches commit themselves to a completely early world religion, which made a strange distinction between body and soul, the sacred and the secular.
So here we are moving towards the exit of the 20th century with a religious community largely adjusted to the status quo, standing as the taillight behind other community agencies rather than a headlight leading men to higher levels of justice. I have traveled the length and breadth of Alabama, Mississippi, and all the other southern states. On swithering summer days and crisp autumn mornings, I have looked at her beautiful churches with their lofty spires pointing heavenward. I have beheld the impressive outlay of her massive religious education buildings. Over and over again, I have found myself asking, what kind of people worship here? Who is their God? Where were their voices when the lips of Governor Barnett dipped with words of interposition and nullification? Where were they when Governor Wallens gave the declaration call for defiance and hatred? Where were their voices of support when tired, bruised, and weary Negro men and women decided to rise from the dark dungeness of compliancy to the bright hills of creative protest?
Yes, these questions are still in my mind. In deep disappointment, I have wept over the laxity of the church. But be assured that my tears have been tears of love. There can be no deep disappointment. There is no deep love. Yes, I love the church. I love her sacred walls. How could I do otherwise? I am in the rather unique position of being the son and the grandson of the great-grandson of preachers. Yes, I see the church as the body of Christ. But oh, how we have blemished and scarred that body through social neglect and fear of being nonconformists. That was a time when the church was powerful. It was during that period when the early Christians rejoiced when they were deemed worthy to suffer for what they believed. In those days, the church was not merely a thermometer that recorded the ideas and principles of popular opinion. It was a thermostat that transformed the mores of society. Wherever the early Christians entered a town, the power structure got disturbed and immediately sought to convict them for being disturbers of the peace and outside agitators. But they went on to conviction to say that they were a colony of heaven and had to obey God rather than man. They were small in number but big in commitment. They were too God-intoxicated to be astronomically intimidated. They brought an end to such ancient evils as an infanticide and gladiatorial contest.
Things are different now. The contemporary church is often a weak, ineffectual voice with an uncertain sound. It is so often the arch supporter of the status quo. Far from being disturbed by the presence of the church, the power structure of the average community is consoled by the church's silent and often vocal sanctions of things that are. But the judgment of God is upon the church as never before. If the church of today does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authentic ring, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed by an irrelevant social club with no meaning for the 20th century. I am meeting young people every day whose disappointment with the church has risen to outright disgust. Maybe again, I've been too optimistic. Is organized religion too inextricably bound to the status quo to save our nation and the world? Maybe I must turn my faith to the inner spiritual church, the church within the church, as true ecclesia and hope of the world. But again, I am thankful to God that some noble souls from the ranks of organized religion have broken loose from the paralyzing chains of conformity and joined us as active partners in the struggle for freedom. They left their secure congregations and walked the streets of Albany, Georgia, They have gone through the highways of the South on torturous rides for freedom. Yes, they have gone to jail with us. Some have been kicked out of their churches or lost support of their bishops and fellow members. But they have gone with the faith that right defeated is stronger than evil triumphant. These men have been the leaven of the lump of the race. Their witness has been the spiritual salt that has preserved the true meaning of the gospel in troubled times. They have carved a tunnel of hope through the dark mountain of disappointment.
I hope the church as a whole will meet the challenge of this decisive hour. But even if the church does not come to the aid of justice, I have no despair about the future. I have no fear about the outcome of our struggle in Birmingham, even if our motives are presently misunderstood. We will reach the goal of freedom in Birmingham and all over the nation, because the goal of America is freedom. Abused and scorned though we may be, our destiny is tied up with the destiny of America. Before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth, we were here. Before the pen of Jefferson etched across the pages of history the majestic words of the Declaration of Independence, we were here. For more than 2 centuries, our foreparents labored in this country without wages. They made cotton king, and they built the homes of their masters in the midst of brutal injustice and shameful humiliation. And yet, out of a bottomless vitality, they continued to thrive and develop. If the inexpressible cruelties of slavery could not stop us, the opposition we now face will surely fail. We will win our freedom because the sacred heritage of our nation and the eternal will of God are embodied in our echoing demands.
I must close now, but before closing, I am impelled to mention one other point in your statement that troubled me profoundly. You warmly commended the Birmingham police force for keeping order and preventing violence. I don't believe you would have so warmly commended the police force if you had seen its angry, violent dogs literally biting 6 unarmed, non-violent Negroes. I don't believe you would so quickly commend the policemen if you would observe their ugly, inhuman treatment of Negroes here in the city jail. If you would watch them push and curse old Negro women and young Negro girls, if you would see them slap and kick old Negro men and young boys, if you will observe them as they did on 2 occasions, refuse to give us food because we wanted to sing our grace together. I'm sorry that I can't join you in your praise for the police department. It is true that they have been rather disciplined in their public handling of the demonstrators. In this sense, they have been rather publicly nonviolent. But for what purpose? To preserve the evil system of segregation. Over the last few years, I have consistently preached that nonviolence demands that the means we must use be as pure as the ends we seek. So I have tried to make it clear that it is wrong to use immoral means to attain moral ends. But now I must affirm that it is just as wrong, or even more so, to use moral means to preserve immoral ends. Maybe Mr. Connor and his policemen have been rather publicly nonviolent, as Chief Pritchett was in Albany, Georgia. But they have used the moral means of nonviolence to maintain the immoral end of flagrant racial injustice. T.S. Eliot has said that there is no greater treason than to do the right deed for the wrong reason.
I wish you had commended the Negro sit-inners and demonstrators of Birmingham for their sublime courage, their willingness to suffer, and their amazing discipline in the midst of the most inhuman provocation. One day, the South will recognize its real heroes. They will be the James Merediths, courageously and with a majestic sense of purpose facing jeering and hostile mobs and the agonizing loneliness that characterizes the life of the pioneer. They will be old, oppressed, battered Negro women, symbolized in a 17-year-old woman of my own town, who rose up with a sense of duty and with her people decided not to ride the segregated buses, and responded to one who inquired of her tiredness with ungrammatical profundity. My feet is tired, but my soul is rested. They will be the young high school and college students, young ministers of the gospel, and a host of their elders courageously and nonviolently sitting in at lunch counters and willingly going to jail for conscience sake. One day the South will know that when these disinherited children of God sat down at lunch counters, they were in reality standing up for the best in the American dream and the most sacred values in our Judeo-Christian heritage, and thusly carrying our whole nation back to those great wells of democracy, which were dug deep by the founding fathers in the formulation of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Never before have I written a letter this long, or should I say a book. I'm afraid that it is much too long to take your precious time. I can assure you that it would have been much shorter if I had been writing from a comfortable desk. But what else is there to do when you are alone for days in the dull monotony of a narrow jail cell? Other than write long letters, think strange thoughts, and pray long prayers?
If I have said anything in this letter that is an overstatement of the truth and is indicative of an unreasonable impatience, I beg you to forgive me. If I have said anything in this letter that is an understatement of the truth and is indicative of my having a patience that makes me patient with anything less than brotherhood, I beg God to forgive me. I hope this letter finds you strong in the faith. I also hope that circumstances will soon make it possible for me to meet each of you, not as an integrationist or a civil rights leader, but as a fellow clergyman and a Christian brother. Let us all hope that the dark clouds of racial prejudice will soon pass away and the deep fog of misunderstanding will be lifted from our fear-drenched communities. And some not too distant tomorrow, the radiant stars of love and brotherhood will shine over our great nation with all of their scintillating beauty. Yours for the cause of peace and brotherhood, Martin Luther King, Jr.
We appreciate our readers. and also our listeners. Thank you very much for being present for this beautiful letter. You know, while he was in prison, he had very little contact, Dr. King, with the outside world. He didn't know that people were following his progress. At first, the local news media refused to cover it. It was papers like the New York Times that gave coverage to it. It was because Coretta Scott King reached out first through Robert F. Kennedy, who was then the Attorney General, then to President Kennedy, who then reached back, that he was moved from solitary confinement and allowed access to counsel. It took presidential and federal intervention for him to receive this kind of attention. Later, what happened in Birmingham, if you want to read the stories and look at the accounts of it, there was a series of increasing peaceful, nonviolent demonstrations in Birmingham that spring and summer. First, the adults got arrested, then the college-age students, then the high school students, then the junior high school students, then even the grammar school students got arrested. Thousands were arrested. The jails couldn't even contain them all. In August of '63 was the incredible March on Washington, a great high point. And then just a few weeks later, on September 15th, the 16th Street Baptist Church was bombed and the lives of 4 young girls were lost just a few weeks later. So it was a beautiful year and a terrible year in Birmingham, and a turning point, many say, in what happened in the civil rights movement. We're going to have an opportunity right now to be in small groups for 15 minutes for you to discuss your feelings about what you've just heard or read. So if you'd like to stay, you're welcome to stay. You'll be assigned in groups of 8 to 10, I believe, randomly. So there's no accounting for what the groups will be composed like. You might be with complete strangers. You might be with people that you know, but you've just had this experience together, so it doesn't matter, really. So I ask you to stick with it. 15 minutes to share your feelings right now while they're fresh. And here's what I'm going to ask you to do in the groups. First, introduce yourselves, okay? So, hello, my name is Jim, and I am a member of Island Church in Foster City, and I live in Oakland. So something like that. One sentence, the one breath rule, okay? Then secondly, did some part of the letter stick with you, or did it speak to you at the moment? And finally, how did the letter speak to you about how you want to do something today? What about then speaks to you now? Okay, those 3 things. I'm going to type them quickly. And as I said, 15 minutes in a small group, and then we'll come back and dismiss, singing a verse together of We Shall Overcome. So these are the questions, and then I'm not sure who is going to assign us to groups. You have to say yes if you want to do it.
So the breakout rooms have been opened. I'll broadcast a message to all the breakout rooms that give you the questions that you should be answering. But if you've joined your breakout room and you're starting to get critical mass, please feel free to start going around and introducing yourself, your name, your congregation, and the city that you live in.
So I want to thank everyone for being in small groups. I want to thank everyone who participated in the reading today. And I don't know how far you got in your small groups, but we did get to introduce ourselves certainly and hear about some issues in my group, at least, that people felt. And I think the summary issue was a lot about what was happening then seems like it's still happening still. It wasn't just about a history piece or a recitation about something that happened 60 years ago. It still seems to speak to us about issues that are still occurring. So I hope that we can take that from today. This was an attempt, even though we couldn't do as many service projects as we wanted. I'm going to ask Sarah, I think, to unmute Alexis, because I don't think I can.
Thank you.
So even though we couldn't do as many service projects, though many people did do some, we felt that education is a kind of service also. And we had at our peak over 150 people reading together the letter. So thank you for that. Alexis, do you want to say something before we close?
I just wanted to say there were about 11 of us that weren't put in breakout rooms that were left. So we didn't get to have a discussion. So hopefully the discussions went well.
Yeah, I'm so sorry.
That's okay. And I just want to say, I think the readings were beautiful, and especially the children. I was very moved by them and their readings. And thanks to the parents that encourage your children to participate, and thanks to all the adults that participated. It was a beautiful, beautiful program, and it was because of all of you.
Great. So I'm going to ask those who remain. We're going to ask everyone to unmute and ask Sarah to unmute us. And I know it's a cacophonous sound, but I'm going to ask us to sing one verse of We Shall Overcome Together. And though it is, I know on Zoom, yes, it doesn't sound pretty, but let's do it as a prayer or as an aspiration or as an intention. It may not be pretty, but let's do it anyway. All right. And if you're comfortable, and the words are, we shall overcome, we shall overcome, we shall overcome someday. Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. And someone is saying if it is slow, it will work better. So we'll try it more slowly than we might if we were outdoors marching, okay? And let's do that. I have a terrible voice, but I'm going to start. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall deep in my heart, I do believe.
Just moving my lips.
We shall overcome someday.
Thank you so much, and appreciate your being here. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.